Could trade talks between the US and China collapse? Donald Trump says Beijing is breaking the deal, while China insists it won't be pressured into making more concessions. So, who's winning the trade war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Attempts to end the US-China trade dispute had appeared to be making progress, but just when a deal was looking more likely, a rift has opened up between the world's two biggest economies. The US says China is backtracking on promises, such as protecting intellectual property and stopping unfair trade practices. President Donald Trump is raising the tariff on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods from Friday. Beijing is promising to retaliate and says it won't bow to pressure to make any more concessions. Both sides are taking an aggressive stance as China's vice premier heads to Washington for the latest round of negotiations.
They broke the deal. They can't do that, so they'll be paying. If we don't make the deal, nothing wrong with taking in over $100 billion a year. 100 billion. We never did that before. And we won't back down until China stops cheating our workers and stealing our jobs. And that's what's going to happen. Otherwise, we don't have to do business with them. We don't have to do business. We can make the product right here if we have to, like we used to. Remember? Like we used to.
Let's hear from our correspondent, Adrian Brown in Beijing.
Well, this was supposed to be the week of popping champagne corks. After 10 months of often tortuous negotiations, 11 rounds of talks, the United States and China were apparently going to finally sign a deal that would end those differences. But on Sunday night, President Donald Trump detonated an art of the deal grenade, just as he did over North Korea. He seemed to be saying that the Chinese side had now begun to drag their feet. They were playing for time. The talks, he said, were going too slowly. His trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, went a step further a few days later. He said the Chinese side had now essentially reneged, gone back on just about everything they had agreed to in those previous negotiations with the United States. Now, the question is, if China has started to backtrack and to backtrack in such a significant way, then why? Well, analysts say this is almost certainly down to intervention by President Xi Jinping, who may well feel that his negotiators have been conceding too much, giving too much away. And this is a year, remember, when China's president, China's leader, has to look strong, stronger than usual, because on October the 1st, China will mark the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, not a year then when a Chinese leader can afford to appear weak. So President Xi Jinping wants a deal, but he doesn't want a deal at any cost. So what happens now? Well, I think here in Beijing, among most experts, analysts you talk to, there is a grim realization, I think, that these tariffs, these new tariffs, are going to happen, and that Chinese negotiators have precious little time to avoid that happening. These negotiations, after all, end on Friday. Now, it is, of course, possible that there'll be a surprise breakthrough, but most, analysts I've spoken to say they feel that, there possibly is going to be a deal eventually, not just now. The question is, the key thing is, will the two sides continue negotiating? If they do, I think that'll be enough to stabilize stock markets here in China, which have suffered their biggest fall, incidentally, in more than 3 years. Big falls as well, of course, in Hong Kong. But if there is a rupture, then, of course, we're going to see market volatility for days, if not weeks to come. In the meantime, China is saying that it's promising countermeasures against any new sanctions without specifying what they are. But it's fair to assume that China has enough in its arsenal to make life very difficult for US corporations here in China if it wants to. Adrian Brown for Inside Story.
While campaigning for president, Donald Trump accused China of stealing US jobs. He ordered a review of the US trade deficit and its main causes once he entered the White House. In March last year, Trump imposed the first round of tariffs directly targeting Chinese products. China soon retaliated. By July, both countries were imposing more than $360 billion of levies on each other. In December, the Chinese and the US presidents agreed to halt new tariffs and begin talks. But before any agreement could be reached, Trump renewed his accusations and threats of new tariffs. Joining us are our guests. In Beijing, Wang, analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit's Access China service. On Skype from Taipei, Feingold, an Asia political risk analyst, attorney and Republican political consultant. And also in Beijing, Einar Tangen, a China political risk analyst who has advised the Chinese government on economic and development issues. I'd like to begin in Beijing with Wang. China and the US have had a fruitful relationship for the last 30 years, ever since China, shall we say, pivoted away from communism and became a global economy. The deal seems to have worked. However, as soon as Donald Trump takes power, there seems to be an issue. Can you just explain to us what's at the heart of all of this?
I think it is a combined result of a shift in power and the interpretation of it. Because in the past 40 years, China is probably the largest beneficiary from the current trading system. It has benefited more than the U.S., with a double-digit economic growth almost every year. So now it lifted millions out of poverty, and it's becoming the second largest economy in the world. But when we look at it, the U.S. economy is doing okay, but not nearly as impressive as China does. And the inequality has become a major issue in the U.S., and the politics is very divided. So facing this, especially after President Xi Jinping has took office, the relationship between U.S. and China has really changed. We saw that the U.S. has labeled China as a revisionist and then as a competitor. So from the original follower of the U.S., China started to rise as this major producer and manufacturer in the world. And now it seems that within 10 years, it's probably going to become the largest economy in the world, competing with the U.S. even in the most advanced technology. And this is something that I don't think the U.S. are ready to accept yet.
Let's bring in Feingold in Taipei. China is about to become the biggest economy in the world. That's just fair competition, isn't it? It's not China's fault that the US has an issue with that, so why pick a fight?
Well, you mentioned the key words, and that's fair competition. So what's changed recently, or in the time that President Trump has been in office since the beginning of 2017, is a consensus in the United States across industry and frankly across both Republicans and Democrats in government that China's government and its companies don't always follow the rules of the global trading system. And that's where there's actually a lot of support in the United States for some of the policies that President Trump has implemented. President Trump has been very clear that he wants a trading relationship. He wants U.S. companies to export to China. He wants U.S. companies to do business in China. But there has to be some observance of reasonable rules and laws. And we see a pattern of Chinese companies involved in intellectual property theft, subsidies from the Chinese government, which really results in an unfair playing field. And that's what President Trump's policies are seeking to address.
Let's bring in Einar Tangen in Beijing also. Einar, the US seems to be suggesting that China is cheating, that it's not playing fairly.
Well, those are nice talk points, but you'll notice that my colleague hasn't brought forth any particular evidence to that fact. The issue is that since Donald Trump came forward and became president, he has been largely involved in what he does best, which is trying to shade the reality of what is happening. China has been rising for quite some time. If you look at what the U.S. has been able to win at the WTO, we're talking in excess of 3/4 of the time. If there are real cases out there, where are they and where have they been lost? Where has China been stealing? There's this narrative that goes on constantly and that seems to be unchallenged, that China has been doing all these nefarious things, yet there isn't a scintilla of proof. The instances where you have had intellectual theft have been very simple to explain. Individuals have been stealing things in order to make profits for themselves. I know that's a stark revelation, but it happens everywhere.
The reality is, though, these are not individual actors. These are often people acting at the urging of the companies that they work for, or in some cases, government agencies. And the number of prosecutions that have occurred in the United States, not just recently, but this is an ongoing problem going back before the Trump administration, even if the Trump administration is more aggressive about bringing prosecutions. But to say that there's no evidence of intellectual property theft, I mean, the facts show otherwise. And similarly, an important issue for U.S. companies and the U.S. government in these trade talks is what's often called forced technology transfer. Now, the reality is that American companies in the technology space to do business in China often have no choice but to work with a Chinese partner. And again, this is something that the U.S. government is trying to address. But to say that there's no evidence that the playing field isn't level or that there isn't cheating going on by the Chinese corporate world or the government, I mean, the facts just don't show that. They show otherwise.
Can you give us an example, Ross, of what you're talking about? A concrete example?
Well, I mean, besides the number of prosecutions, which are well documented and is an ongoing problem, but there are rules in China that require a foreign partner to have a Chinese partner. The American company or European companies, other nationalities, they cannot do certain types of business on their own with China, in China. They're required to have a Chinese company as a partner. So their option is take on a partner, or they're unable to enter the market. And certainly from an American or European perspective, this is not a level playing field, and it is really meant to ensure that Chinese companies have the upper hand and that they can acquire technology from foreign companies.
Dan Wang in Beijing, I want to bring you in here.
I would like to jump in if I may.
Sorry, let me ask the question again. Let me bring in Dan here.
Yeah, I was just going to add a small point. All right.
Yeah. Let me bring Dan in here from Beijing. Dan, you've heard what the other two guests have had to say. A lot of this seems to be about technology transfer, and what the Americans are calling technology theft. China is about to move up in sectors. It's about to move into the tech world, and that seems to be what's driving this. Is China stealing technology?
Well, I'm in no intention to defend a lot of practices that Chinese government does. It does give unfair comparative advantage to a lot of state-owned enterprises. But in terms of stealing technology, I think there are different interpretations of it. Because if we're talking about protecting the domestic industry, this is an industrial policy that many countries have adopted in their earlier stage of development. So we're talking about development policies here. You can't just open up the market, say like the South African 1980s, because before you have an industrial base, opening up the market to foreign investors just bluntly will cause very devastating results, because then you will pretty much lose all your industrial advantage that you could have had, because those domestic industry needs some time to grow. And for those foreign competitors, foreign investors, I think it's fair to say that they use technology in exchange to get access into the Chinese market, and it is fair play.
Aina in Beijing, Dan makes an interesting point there. You protect markets in their infancy, you develop them, but this Chinese market isn't in its infancy. We're talking 40 years on now. So maybe it is time to have a level playing field. Maybe it is time to do a new deal with the US.
Well, I don't know if a new deal with the U.S. on the current terms is in the cards, but yes, I would agree that China, for its own benefit, needs to open up, and they're doing that exactly. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is not, contrary to public opinion, U.S. International media opinion, something that's nefarious and aimed at trying to subvert countries into a debt trap. It's simply the only current economic plan to increase basically what would be WTO 2.0. And that means physical connectivity in addition to the idea that you have these trade alignments. So, I noticed my colleague did not was not able, Mr. Feingold was not able to point to any specific advantages, talking about numerous prosecutions. I mean, this is the narrative that China is facing. I mean, whether you agree or not with this idea that China is a developing country that is trying to protect its industries and grow, much as the U.S. was back in the late 1800s when it was battling Europe as a new entry into the economic sphere and used to routinely dismantle looms in Great Britain and then ship them overnight to the U.S. in order to break the monopolies that the British had, especially on woven goods. These are things that happen in advanced economies. But China, all right, and I'd like to hear from Mr. Feingold on this, has been observant of the WTO. This idea that China has been a routine, lawless entity roaming the world and not obeying any laws is nonsense. Every time they have been ruled against at the WTO, they have complied. That is more than the U.S. can claim.
Russ Feingold, your response?
Well, we have to be careful about mixing different issues. A dispute over the Belt and Road Initiative and whether or not it's nefarious or creates a debt trap for the countries that participate is also very much a political question or international security question. That's not really what's on the table in discussions about market access in China or protection of intellectual property. But again, on the intellectual property issue, the number of prosecutions, the ongoing ones, some of which are very high profile, including the one that gets a lot of media attention, such as Huawei, which is accused of stealing intellectual property. So again, to say that there's no evidence of that, that's not accurate. But to say that China complies with WTO rules in some situations, again, that is not the heart of the dispute or what the United States or Europe are trying to achieve in their negotiations. They're trying to address market access issues.
I want to bring you in here again. Our guest in Beijing, Einar Tangen, said that, yes, it's probably time for a new deal to be made, but this one that the US is currently offering, or that the US and China are currently trying to negotiate, isn't the right deal. What do you think is the right deal?
Because this trade war or trade tension was started by the U.S. If we think about what happened 2 years ago, it was with the 301 investigation. And that was in terms of calling China a thief of the foreign intellectual property and its lack of protection of IP. And to be fair, over the past 1 year, we have seen China strengthening its IP protection and also widen its market access. So now it looks like the new deal that the U.S. very much wants to achieve is for China to do more industrial policy change. And this is something that actually exactly the thing that China cannot budge. Because we all know that the U.S. wants China to go with the market economy, this line, and then to become more democratic over time. But for China, it is a very different political system and has a very different social climate from the U.S. So by just simply introducing those market-based rules doesn't really guarantee us the first best, the market economy that the U.S. has been enjoying. So I think for China to defend its baseline of protecting its domestic industry, there's a lot of justification to that. But in terms of opening more of the domestic market, I do think more outside pressure is good for China because from Trump's tweet, if it's accurate, it is actually a reflection of the lack of consensus on the China's top leadership over how much to compromise and in what aspect China should compromise. And opening up what area and how much of the domestic market, it is a sticky point. And I think the more China opens and the faster it does, it actually is more beneficial to its future economy.
Ross Feingold in Taipei, this is something that I hear quite a lot, and I've been speaking to people about this. There is a deal to be done with China, but this isn't one because this is simply far too aggressive and it's too much for the Chinese to actually do in the time frame that you would like to give them. Are you being too aggressive? Is your administration, this Trump administration, being too aggressive?
Well, the two sides have been talking for over 2 years, so it's certainly likely or that they want a deal. President Trump wants a deal. He has domestic constituencies that very much want him to reach a deal, most notably the agricultural exporters. But if they ask for too much, then obviously the Chinese side is going to walk away. One thing we've learned over the last 2 years is that the governments, and specifically the two leaders, they seem to be have a certain risk appetite. And I think as analysts or the public, we often underestimate their risk tolerance for prolonging this dispute until they get the deal that they want.
Einar Tengen, what happens if China walks away from any talks with the US? What happens then?
Well, first off, China isn't walking away. They're the ones who have gone to Washington with a 100-man team in order to try to figure this thing out. And that is after a very aggressive move by Donald Trump. Now, let's look at this, step back a second. I mean, this is the second time that we've seen Donald Trump throw something on the table. He did it with young Kim and say, give me everything. And then saying, oh, he broke the deal because he didn't give me everything. I mean, this is a very standard practice for him. Now, let's step back even further. Here you have the most powerful political, economic, and military nation on earth, a nation who has enjoyed a part of the 66% of the entire world's profits over the last 30 years. But yet, over the last 15 years, the population, the middle-class population has actually declined. 90% of the United States has experienced a minus 0.4% drop in real income. Now, they're coming out, Donald Trump leading the charge, saying somehow we've been a victim. We've been taken advantage of. Well, and they're blaming the people, the 86% of the rest of the world, who received 1/3 of the world's profits over this period of time, yet whose middle classes boomed, and saying that somehow they are at fault. The issue here is the inequality and the inability of Western nations, Europe and America, to distribute their income in a way which benefits society. So you have a lot of anger, but it's misplaced anger. And you have populists like Donald Trump who are trying to aim that at rising nations like China.
Ross, I want to bring you in here from Taipei. We are running out of time, but I do want to bring you in very quickly. Is this Donald Trump distracting from domestic issues, as our guest in Beijing seems to be saying?
Well, President Trump has been very good at controlling the narrative when it comes to the trade disputes. And frankly, he's been very good at isolating it from other domestic issues. Obviously, the Mueller investigation has just concluded. There's still a lot of action by Democrats in that regard. But Democrats actually are very supportive of President Trump's trade policies. So, no, it's not a situation where he's trying to distract. This is something that's important to American companies.
Dan, in Beijing, I want to ask you, are you confident that a deal can be done between these two very powerful economic countries?
I will be very surprised if there is no deal. Even if it's a very limited deal, it will be good for both sides. At least before the coming election, that's something that Donald Trump can tell his voters. It's because if he work out a magic. And for China's side, if there is no deal in the short term, its economic performance will be suffered by a lot, mainly through the lack of confidence in consumption and investment. And also for 2019, its GDP growth probably will slow down a lot if there is no deal. So the stakes are high.
Well, let me thank all our guests. An incredibly interesting discussion. Dan Wang, Ross Feingold and Einar Tengen. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.